Simon, it is great to have you here today. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, and we've been chatting over Substack for the last sort of few weeks and months, and it's really cool to get to meet you face to face, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks. No, really exciting to be on here. Yeah, I've been listening to the podcast. It's good stuff. And yeah, I think we've been chatting back and forth for a while, haven't we? And I love the way those connections kind of form on Substack, where I can never remember how I stumble upon people in the first place. Like, I have no idea at what point I found your work, but then you just like these sort of, you start circling around each other, don't you? And then reading stuff and listening to things, and you're like, oh, this person's interesting. And then the next thing you know, they're like a regular part of your like morning's reading or whatever.
Yeah, that's just it. I love Substack for that because it's just so organic. So much of the time, there's no real forced connection. I don't think everything just seems to happen in a really nice, organic, friendly kind of way, which is great. But yeah, Simon, I really want to have you on here today, and I'm glad you listened to the podcast too. That's always nice to hear. I don't know if everybody does listen to it, who I bring on, but yeah, I want to have you on because obviously you are doing a really good job with your Substack publication. I've been watching what you're doing and reading your stuff and seeing how you're growing and the kind of advice that you're sharing. And I also want to talk to you about publishing serialized fiction online because I think you're one of the best people at that at the minute. And I really love what you do. And I want to hear more about your process and what you think about it and what your plans are for the future. But as we start off, can you just tell me a little bit about your background? So, where are you based? How have you come to be at this point in life? And yeah, just tell our readers all about yourself.
How have you come to be at this point in your life? That feels like a really big question, doesn't it? Yeah, so I'm based in Norwich in the UK. Been here for 24 years, came to university here and didn't leave, which I think happens to a lot of people when they come to Norwich. And yeah, I've got a background in kind of arts marketing and working around creative sector generally. Always wanted to be a writer, never quite got around to it for a long time until like my mid 30s, at which point like I'd always been dabbling. I'd never not been writing, but it never quite amounted to anything. And then my son was born about 12 years ago, at which point that whole thing about putting it off and being like, oh, I'll do it like when I'm ready, or like when all the stars align, when I've got more time, etc. And then you realize like when you have a child, you're never going to have more time ever again. That's it. So I needed to knuckle down.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I started a job at the National Centre for Writing, which is based in Norwich, but operates nationally and internationally, and was therefore surrounded suddenly by authors and
Hmm.
just writers everywhere, events we were putting on. And I ended up doing a podcast there where I got to talk to loads of people. So at the same time, I was like, I need to actually get on with some writing. And the problem I always had was finishing a project. And sort of by accident, I fell into serialized publishing.
Hmm.
Started off as an experiment. I was like, this sounds quite fun. It sounds quite fancy, but I'd been to South by Southwest out in Austin and ended up talking to some people that were, I think they worked at Tapas, which is like an online serial platform, which I think is still around. But I ended up going down the Wattpad route just as an experiment. I was like, I'll do this for a couple of weeks and see if this is fun. And it was really fun. And I discovered that if I write and publish as I go, and then know that there's some readers out there. At first, there was obviously one reader, but once people start showing up and reading it, that clicked something in my brain that got me coming back to the page and keep writing. And I've kind of done that ever since. So I've been publishing weekly serials for the last 10 years, essentially. So that's how I discovered, semi by accident, what was meant to be a short-term experiment, then turned into basically the way that I write.
Hmm.
And writing on Wattpad went really well in the context of what that means on Wattpad. So I had like hundreds of thousands of reads on these books. I did three kind of novels, if you like, over on Wattpad. The numbers were huge, but it was that kind of like sort of social media numbers where they're like massive numbers that sound really cool, but don't really mean anything, and you can't really do anything with it. What's the point? So then in 2021, that's when I shifted over to Substack because I think Elle Griffin, I'd interviewed her for the Writer Centre podcast that I was producing, and she's obviously a massive Substack like promoter, and at the time was talking about it a lot. And this was quite early, relatively early days for Substack. Like it was still back then just a newsletter thing. That
Hmm.
was what it did. But I thought that sounded interesting and basically started from scratch again because the thing with Wattpad, you don't own your audience, so you can't transfer it. So started from scratch, started doing the same kind of stuff like weekly fiction, added in a weekly newsletter about my process and serial writing,
Hmm.
and have been doing that ever since. And that kind of brings me up to today, which is where I have this newsletter that's grown into a really interesting thing, and loads of people have shown up. And the difference is that it's properly my audience this time, and that success feels more earned than the Wattpad kind of slightly spurious, don't know where they came from, don't know where they went kind of
Yeah.
audience. And yeah, and ended up in this cool community with the likes of you and everyone else. And suddenly it's this kind of bubbling, exciting thing of online writers operating in all sorts of different spaces, but fiction is my thing. And finding that online community of people who are poking at what this thing can do and what it means to have a newsletter and publish online, which should have been a thing for ages, but it still feels weirdly like a new thing. So that's where we are.
Yeah, no, I agree. It does still feel weirdly new. I think it's a great way to describe it. I think there's so many people out there who are still chasing the kind of vanity metrics that the likes of Wattpad and social media in general push us towards, as if that really means anything, but it just doesn't so much anymore. I think that's why Substack is so powerful because you're owning your audience. You can take your audience with you if you want to leave and go somewhere else, which is probably the most powerful feature about it. And yeah, as you say, it does just, it feels new, it feels vibrant, it feels real in some way. Like I really connected with Substack at the end of last year and just haven't really looked back since then. Really enjoyed it as a platform. And yes, it's given me the chance to connect with people like yourself and all the other people I've met on the platform so far over the last few months, which is great. Simon, so you publish serialized fiction on Substack. What is your process for that? So it's something I've started to do as well the last few months with my third small publication. And I'm still trying to figure out the cadence for that. But in terms of what you do, how often do you publish? Oh, I know it's weekly, but in terms of how much do you publish each time? Is it like a chapter or is it just a segment or what way
Mhm.
does that work for you in terms of fiction?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a new installment every week. I tend to like I always say 1,200 words is what I focus on achieving each week and sending out.
Mm,
It usually ends up being a bit more than that, but I found that sort of the sweet spot in terms of not only what I can practically put together each week. Like I know I can definitely do that every week, no problem. But it's also good for the readers, I think, because it's enough words that the chapter has some substance. Like you can do some good character stuff. You can have an interesting new plot beat. There's something to get your teeth into. Any shorter, and it gets a little bit flimsy, I think.
mm,
But any longer, and obviously it takes longer to read. And I think the problem or the challenge there is that the longer you get, the more you're starting to compete for time with everything else that people might want to be doing, whether that's family stuff, job stuff, watching Netflix, reading books by fancy professional authors that they bought in a bookshop, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas if you're 1,200 words, you can read that in a single sitting very easily, like over breakfast or on the bus to work or just in between other stuff you're doing. And yeah, that's where I've ended up. So
mm.
both my end and the reader's end, I think that works nicely. I write and publish as I go. So that's quite often like the first question people have, which is, have you written the entire manuscript ahead of time? Which a lot of people do. That's a completely legit way of doing it. But I don't do that. So I write and publish as I go, pretty much without a buffer. I wouldn't necessarily recommend because it can be quite, well, it could be quite stressful. Like, I don't find it stressful. I find it quite exciting. The idea that the readers are coming along for the ride at the same time and they're witnessing the story form in front of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of what keeps me being productive, being consistent. And because if you're doing an online serial, that's quite a risk for a reader because this thing is not finished yet. If you buy a book in a bookshop, you're not going to suddenly get to page like 100 and the book just stops and they didn't get around to finishing it or something. With an online serial, there's nothing to protect you if the author just disappears off the internet or
Mm,
gives up or what have you. So having that reliable cadence and hitting the release points each time over a long period of time is important because then when new readers show up, they can be like, oh, okay, this person is taking it seriously. And if I jump on board now, I know I'm not going to be wasting my time. Practically, I lean very heavily on Scrivener, the software for the actual writing. It helps me not go mad. I think it keeps all my notes and thoughts in one place and makes it very easy to see the overall kind of narrative structure of the story, which when you're writing very fast and having to reference back things that you've done maybe years earlier, like if it was just a big Word document, that would be horrendous. But Scrivener makes it very easy to zoom out to that structural level and remind yourself what it is that you've committed to.
You'd basically describe my process there in terms of the Word document. I have a very messy, all over the place approach sometimes, and I do find myself having to scroll back and try and find things that I've written before and try not to contradict myself. So I know I've used Scrivener as well, and it is very good. I really probably really should take it more seriously and use it as a platform. Definitely a really good tool. Do you ever feel, I know you mentioned that you don't really feel under pressure in terms of publishing, but is there ever a point where you feel stuck with a section of your book and you feel like I just have to get this 1,200 words out so that so the cadence remains the same? Do you ever feel that kind of pressure, or do you just not really care?
It's quite rare, I think. And like the way I plan my stories, I don't, I'm not like a pan. I really hate that word, but I'm not someone who just makes it up as I go. Because
Mm,
I think, particularly with the way I write and published, that would just be too chaotic for me and for readers. There'd be no foreshadowing or like resonance and character arcs and pacing would just be all over the shop. But at the same time, I don't plan it out to fine detail. So I know where I'm going and I've got like key waypoints along the way, but how I get from A to B is quite up for grabs.
mm,
What that means is that the creative process is still active as I'm doing the actual writing. So that helps it to not get boring. If I plotted everything out to a really fine degree, then I think the writing becomes less interesting
mm.
because you already know what you're doing and you're just trying to hit the points that you're going through. Whereas keeping it a little bit fuzzy lets the characters breathe and do unexpected things, and maybe you can go off on a slight tangent, but you always have those waypoints to navigate back to where you're supposed to be. So I very rarely end up in a place where I'm slogging through it and don't like where the story's going. Usually, if anything, I'm usually impatient to get to a really cool plot point that I know is coming up. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be so cool. And particularly, like the real challenge is having lots of disparate plot threads and character beats and stuff slowly coming together and linking up, which in a traditional novel, like if you write a whole manuscript, you can obviously go back and edit and layer back in stuff like that. So it all gets tightened up in rewrites in the edit. But if you're publishing as you go, you can't do that in quite the same way. So there's an element of huge satisfaction when something that you wrote 2 years ago does suddenly pay off and makes you feel very clever.
Yeah, I feel that too. As we were saying just before this conversation, I just finished writing a novel. I literally just typed the words the end like 20 minutes before this chat. And it was a part I've been waiting to write for like months. I had this scene in my head that I just could not wait to put onto the page, and I was finally able to do it. There's immense satisfaction around that for sure. And Simon, I just want to ask about in terms of you talk about your process there about you're not a pantser and you plot, but it's fairly loose. What does it actually look like in terms of what you write down on a page in advance? Do you write down like bullet points for what you want to roughly hit for a chapter, or what does it look like?
Yeah, so it will depend on what's happening in the chapter sometimes. So particularly with Triverse, the thing I've been writing through the newsletter, it's quite a sort of episodic anthology type scenario. So most of it up until quite recently actually has been essentially like procedural, like detective investigations. So it will start off as like a one-line thing where, this is what the setup is, like some crime has taken place or something odd's happened that they're investigating. And I might have written that down 6 months prior as a kind of, oh, this would be a cool idea. It might be something that I've seen in the news in like real life. And I'm like, oh, I could transpose this into my sci-fi setting and do something interesting with that.
Hmm.
So then when I get close to being like, I'm going to write this storyline, I'll then flesh it out a little bit, have like maybe a couple of paragraphs where I just work out like, what is this actually about? But then that has to get broken down into however many parts it's going to be. So it might be a 5-part story, that particular one. And it's very sharply focused on the chapter I'm writing in any given week. And then the further away, the less focused it is. And quite often I find my way through it as I'm going. But again, it's knowing the sort of destination, but being okay to explore it along the way. And then per chapter, I'll sometimes write down beat by beat what needs to happen in it, because when you've got those 1,200 words, you need to make good use of them. And if I want to end on a particular point, I then need to figure out how to get there. And yeah, it depends slightly on the nature of it. Like sometimes you get a very character driven chapter where it's a couple of characters having a chat and maybe nothing much more happens than that. And that tends to be more I just find that in the writing. If it's an action based chapter, Not necessarily, I don't mean necessarily like a big fight where there's lots of movement and things are happening and things have to slot into place.
Mm,
Then I might write down specifically like this happens and this happens so that I understand the geography of the scene or
yeah,
like how it works, and that helps with the pacing of it as well, I think.
yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit of everything depending on what's needed. So the amount of planning is very flexible. It adjusts depending on the particular needs of what I'm writing at any given point.
In terms of character development, do you have a very strong understanding of what your characters are like and what they want to achieve in the course of the story, or do you just let them dictate roughly how they develop as you tell the story?
It's a bit of both, but
Mm,
I think so with Triverse, it's quite a large cast. So I worked out a lot of the characters ahead of time. So that what that meant was basically having a little mini bio, not like pages and pages, like a paragraph on who's this person, where they come from. And then I like to write a little secret or a conflict that they have, may or may not be relevant to the story. It might not ever come out as an actual plot point, but it's something that is motivating them behind the scenes that the reader doesn't know about, which gives them a bit of interest. And then I would probably write down like a character arc. So if someone goes from A to B, what is that little journey?
mm,
And I have a little character matrix thing that I work out as well, where I've got it's like lots of different personality traits that I pick. It's a little bit like the sort of classic Dungeons and Dragons
mm.
chaotic, neutral, evil thing, but it's less morally judgmental. It's more like kind of character quirks and personalities. But
Yeah,
what that helps is particularly with a large cast or where you've got like guest characters coming in, if I fill out this little matrix thing, it gives me the tone of voice and like the way they respond to things and what their
yeah,
dialogue might sound like. So I have that for each character, and a lot of that I developed up front. But then once I actually start the writing, like I always try to not be shackled to that kind of thing, whether it's character sheets or plot details. Most of my good ideas I feel come about during the writing.
mm,
So I never want to be just like I planned it out like this, so it has to stay like this, because actually I'll probably come up with better ideas once I start writing. But yeah,
mm,
working out a bit of that ahead of time, particularly when you're publishing as you go, it means you can foreshadow and layer in some stuff at the start that you know is going to be satisfying 6 months down the line.
mm. And are your characters based on people that you know in any capacity, even in terms of their traits, or are they just entirely sculpted together for the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think they're probably mostly, there's going to be bits of people I know in them and bits of me in all of them as well,
Mm,
to varying degrees. But it's interesting because I think something I try to do is make my like casts of characters increasingly not so much diverse, but just an interesting mix. Because I
mm,
think in my earlier books, I would maybe play because I was learning the ropes of how to write stuff. I suppose I was maybe writing a bit closer to what I knew, and over time I've been like, well, actually no, I want to broaden out the cast in terms of all sorts of things because you can tell more stories then,
yeah,
and you have more interesting interactions between characters if they're quite different and coming at things from different perspectives, and then you can challenge yourself to write a character that maybe if I met them I would really dislike them, but then you have to write them in a way that they make sense. They're not like a bad guy. Their motivations make sense for them. So, and that's where a lot of the fun comes in.
No, definitely, I agree. I feel the same way about that. My process, I think, has changed as well, where I wrote more what I knew at the start and had to like not force myself to diversify the kind of characters I'm writing about, but just open myself up to that more and be more willing to try that and to write about characters who I wouldn't necessarily often meet in real life, but if I did meet them, they would be quite interesting to have a conversation with, that sort of way.
Yeah.
And I spoke to Evelyn Sky about this kind of stuff, about her process and what it looks like and what she kind of pictures in her mind. I don't know if you listened to that episode, but what she talked about was how I can't remember what the word is for it, but how she basically doesn't see an image played out in her mind. It's just that she doesn't actually picture anything whenever she writes. It just happens on the page. For you, whenever you are writing a scene, can you see it playing out like a movie reel in your head, or what way does that work for you in your process?
Yeah, I think I'm quite a visual person. So I had a background in filmmaking, like very much like amateur filmmaking, but I studied film at university. I was massively into movies as a teenager. So and I just lap up all the behind the scenes stuff on that. So I think I have a sort of amateur's cinematographer eye on a lot of this stuff. And like I'm the sort of person who like if I have a dream at night and it's some ridiculously dramatic dream, like in the dream I will pause and go, oh, that's a nice shot. and just admire my imagination's own cinematography. Do you know what I mean? That's how my
That's
brain
cool.
works. Yeah, it's very weird. That has literally happened in a dream. It was very peculiar.
Oh,
Um, but I think, yeah, when it comes to writing, I do have quite a visual sense of it. And
mm,
I like to, is it particularly if it's a new location or if there is some kind of elaborate action sequence going on? I think I approach that from a quite a cinematic perspective. Quite often, my reference points when I'm writing a chapter will be movies or TV shows where I'll be like, I want this to have the feeling of confidential or something like that. Those will be the touch points, and that will then I might then put the soundtrack on from that film, and that will infuse, in theory, at least, infuse the atmosphere of what I'm writing, and yeah, and that kind of thing.
that's a great idea.
Uh,
Yeah, I think we have similar kind of approaches in that sense. And I actually study film at university as well, alongside English, which is quite funny. Yeah, I would see things very much in a film track being played out in my head in advance of writing the scene, and then while it's actually happening as well. I think I do write in a very uh filmic is probably not the right word, but in that kind of sense, it's almost like a screenplay that's been fleshed out more and starts with the dialogue and kind of builds out from that point rather than the other way around. But yeah, and in terms of writing, Simon, how long, whenever you sit down to write one of these portions and you write your 1,200 or so words, how long does that actually take you to do it? Do you do it in one sitting or do you do it over the course of the week before you actually post it?
Yeah, it's usually over the course of the week, which has changed. Back with my previous serials, I used to have like an evening when I'd be like, this is my writing evening, and it would be like all in, focused, write that thing, which worked quite well. But with Triverse, I've spread it out a bit, partly because it's a slightly more complicated beast. But yeah, so I tend to do it over 2 or 3 nights, depending on the nature of it. I can write a chapter in a couple of hours, but I tend to take a little bit longer. And it's hard to, in terms of actually getting the words onto the page, that's one thing. But then there's a huge amount of time figuring out what is happening here. How does this relate? I need to go and do some research of my own book to remind myself what the hell I wrote 3 years ago, this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of kind of surrounding faffing that you have to do in order for it to actually come together. And these days I record an audio version of each chapter as well.
Mm.
So you have to factor that in on the back end of production. So yeah, but yeah, I think I write fairly fast, and I've did a lot of copywriting professionally, which I think has helped a bit in terms of having a base level of quality that is okay. Some writers will, their first draft will be a complete disaster, like deliberately that's their method, and then they'll hone it into something that's amazing. Because I think I start off at an okay position and then go from there and edit as I write as I go along, rather than finishing a first draft and then rewriting multiple drafts in terms of how I do it.
I suppose in terms of publishing serialized fiction online, you have to do that to some extent because if you just did splurge a messy first draft on the Substack, and then it'd be difficult to go back and do anything about that in future. It's already out there. So I guess you would have to put a fairly polished or completely polished version of your work online right from the get-go. A question actually, some people have maybe asked about publishing serialized fiction online. Say, for instance, you wanted to whenever you finish the book, you want to publish it in print, or you've already finished the entire book and you're just publishing it online afterwards in that sense. Is there ever a sense of worry that someone is going to steal it? I know this isn't necessarily something that does happen often, but I think for some writers it is in the back of their mind. If I'm putting my words online, could somebody else just take this and end up
Mm-hmm.
publishing my book before me in like print form, just take it and steal it? Is that ever a worry for you, or do you not really worry about that?
I don't worry about it, but clearly lots of people do, because I get asked this quite a lot.
Mm,
I've heard other people, like even before I got into writing, like this was a thing that just writers ask
mm,
incessantly. And I remember someone asking, I think I was at a convention, and somebody asked one of the writers about, is there a danger when you send a manuscript off to an agent or even to a publisher that they're just going to steal it and publish it? And they were like, that's not going to happen.
mm,
And I think my perspective is that no legit publisher is going to steal your work and publish it, because
mm,
their entire business relies on having the trust of authors and readers and the industry, etc. So that's not going to happen. In terms of someone stealing it and self-publishing it and going about it that way, like that might happen, but ultimately, like readers who are for some reason buying weird stuff like that, like those probably aren't the readers that I want.
yeah.
There's plenty of readers who want to go to the source and find the actual author and have that interaction, that I'll focus on them rather than worrying about people who are maybe getting dodgy pirated copies. And I think that kind of applies to most things. If you look at games or movies or anything, like the more companies try and crack down on piracy, what tends to happen is that the legitimate customers who actually are quite willing to pay for stuff end up suffering
Mm.
because of all the hoops you now have to jump through, and the people who are pirating it in whatever form just carry on doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not really something that I worry about particularly. In
Yeah.
some ways, like if someone is trying to do that, then they presumably think they can make some money from the work. So that's a seal of approval. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned there about wanting to go to the source in terms of the author. How important do you think the relationship is now between the author and the readers? Is it different now than maybe it was pre things like Substack and Wattpad? Before there was this kind of barrier between a writer writes their book, publisher publishes it, puts it out there, and there's no real direct connection with the actual author beyond their actual words, but that's very different now. Do you think that's now a major aspect of writing in general, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think it's great. So yeah, a bit before, like writers would only meet readers at maybe a book launch or a promotional event of some sort, like very organized things that happen, and usually that only happen around the release of a new book. So then in between, it's you're just on your own, it's silence. And I'm sure some authors preferred that. And I think social media shifted it a little bit back when social media still actually worked because you could then have a sort of connection to them. But I think maybe we all thought that those connections were a bit closer and more meaningful than they were.
Mm,
It was still very much a kind of broadcast scenario. And I think Substack and the sort of newsletter thing where they can just go straight to their readers is really interesting because yeah, it does break down those kind of complicated barriers. And if an author wants to, they can just have a direct conversation with the people that are reading their stuff and vice versa, which I think is great. That's a big part of how I write because knowing that those people are out there and reading is part of what helps me write. Basically, if I can't write in isolation. If I was writing a manuscript in my office or whatever, and it was just on the computer, and it took me a couple of years to write it, like I'd never do it because it'd be too easy to just sort of walk away and no one would ever know.
mm.
There's a thing about publishing online that keeps me a bit more honest, I think, and
You're like
I don't feel
accountable.
like yeah, exactly. It's accountability and not being distracted by other shiny things. I'm like, no, I have to do this thing. I'm going to do it properly and take it seriously. Yeah, and it works. And I think whether it's comments or people hitting the like button,
Mm,
there's something quite magical when you get someone like a new reader that you don't know them, you've not met them before, but they maybe you see them subscribe and then they like chapter one that I published 3 years ago. So they do a little like on chapter one, and then maybe 15 minutes later they like chapter two, and you're like, ah. And then another 15 minutes later they like chapter three, and you're like, oh, they're literally reading my book
you're going through your
at
book.
this exact moment, and I'm getting little notifications as they progress through it, and that direct feedback that yes, somebody in the world is reading my stuff right now is really exciting. And you don't get that with any other way of publishing, really. If you sell books, you know that you've sold the product that is the book, but you have no idea if anyone ever read it.
Mm,
Like it could have just gone on a shelf and not been read. Even ebooks, like you don't get that kind of feedback. So yeah, this kind of granular like confirmation that yes, people are actually reading it and seem to be enjoying it. That's it's very cool.
yeah, I was going to ask you about what the main benefits of publishing serialized fiction online are, but that's like probably the main one straight away is just that accountability and gratification that you're getting as you're writing. Do you ever base or do people's comments or their feedback or their reaction to a portion of your writing ever influence what happens further down the line? So do you maybe write a scene and then people are like, "Oh, that's amazing," and there are loads and loads of positive feedback about it, and then you think my readers want more of this kind of stuff, so that's going to slightly change the tangent of what way the story was going to go. Does that ever happen? Is there much influence there between your readers and yourself?
Not too much. And I think it's like a bit of a slippery slope if you start doing that because you could end up in that situation where you're trying to please everybody and then the story ends up super generic or super weird because you're trying to fit into everyone's different ideas of what it is.
Yeah.
Generally, I try to avoid that so that it's still very much my thing because that's
Mm,
presumably why those people showed up in the first place. But it's still, it's like a little barometer of is this scene working? Is this chapter working? And sometimes responses will be not what you expected. And then you might be like, oh, maybe I should emphasize that plot point a bit more
mm,
because I don't feel like I've done it enough yet, or that kind
yeah.
of thing. With what I'm writing, there's a lot of kind of mystery element to the police investigations. It's quite interesting as I'm dropping clues and hints to see what people are thinking. And sometimes they're like on the right track. And it's like, yeah, I seem to be pacing this information correctly. And then other times I'll go off on a tangent that was not intended at all, but it's still really interesting. The only time I've been more directly influenced is one of my kind of long-term readers really latched onto a character who was in the very first chapter and was only ever meant to be like a one-off like guest character and was never going to come back. And this particular reader like just wanted to know what happened to her. Like for years it was going, what happened to Sally? And I was like, that doesn't matter. But then a few months ago, I actually ended up doing like a multi-part flashback story about what happened to this character. And I did that because it made sense at that point in the story and was useful for all sorts of reasons. But at the same time, I probably wouldn't have thought of doing it if they hadn't semi-jokingly mentioned it so much over the years. So
Mm.
I think what they actually ended up getting was not at all what they expected. But that was an interesting case of the reader feedback
Mm.
influencing what I did, like quite a long time later.
That's so interesting, isn't it? That there's that really like organic, like just yeah, just like almost like friendship kind of relationship between you and your readers, and there's like a give and take aspect to it, which just would not have existed a few years ago, I don't think, maybe a decade ago
Yeah.
or more. And in terms of your Substack, Simon, how are you working that? So obviously you're publishing a couple of pieces each week in dual aspects of your publication. How are you monitoring your growth? Is growth a factor for you? Do you care about it or do you not really mind? Do you have big plans for Substack further down the line in terms of an income generation machine, or do you not really mind? Is it just more about getting your words out there online on the internet?
Yeah. I think if I said that growth didn't matter to me, I'd be doing a big lie. But I try to not make it the main thing.
Mm,
So it was never the point of it.
mm,
So the point is always to do the writing and tell cool stories. Like that's the entire purpose of it. And then with the other half, like the non-fiction stuff I write, which is writing about writing and exploring like serialization and that kind of stuff. That's just partly because I just enjoy doing it, but also to help other people who might enjoy writing in this way. So that's the point for doing it. But having said that, the growth is interesting and seeing this weekend I just went over 5,000 subscribers, which
brilliant.
was very exciting. And it's an interesting thing because you can get pulled in certain directions if you start to think about it from a kind of strategy perspective. And it's always that push and pull of how much you want to do that. Do you want to get really tactical and look at the posts that were most successful and double down on that kind of stuff? Or do you just want to carry on doing what you actually enjoy?
Mm.
And I'm constantly wrestling with how much of one and the other I want to do. I
Are,
think, you know,
are there certain levers in terms of growth? Have you seen whenever you've done a certain thing in terms of maybe like notes or recommendations or anything like that, and you've seen a little bit of a spike? Have you ever noticed that kind of thing happening, or what do you think?
yeah, no, definitely. So I think growth accelerated quite considerably when notes appeared. So that was, what was that? That was like start of 2023, I
Mm,
think. Like if you look at the graph, there's a definite uptick when notes appeared. And also the recommendations system as well, when that started kicking into high gear.
mm,
And then you get this interesting cumulative effect because obviously the more readers you get, and some of them are writers as well. So then the more recommendations you get from them, which then gets you more readers, and you end up in this really interesting loop. Substack's put in place. Notes is a more complicated thing, but that recommendations feature, when it first appeared, I was like, how is this any different to just linking to people you like?
mm,
Like, this doesn't sound like a very exciting thing, but actually, it's a really simple feature that has a massive impact on your overall kind of growth and visibility. And then I think, when was it, mid 2023? So I'd had decent growth with kind of free subscribers, but there wasn't really any paid subscriber growth. It wasn't something I'd ever massively pushed. And then mid 2023, that started to tick up as well. And it seems to coincide with when I started doing some video stuff, like tutorials on how to do Substack things, how to do stuff in Scrivener, that more like nuts and bolts, like here's how you do stuff. That seems to be what brings in the paid audience. And I should say, pretty much everything I do, I put out for free. So I don't paywall anything. Currently, that might change at some point in the future, but so far it's all for free. So my conversion to paid subscribers is quite low compared to the overall number of free subscribers. But I still find it really interesting how many I have, given that they don't have to pay for any of it. And I think where I've ended up landing with that is that they're not really paying for a product. So, like in terms of the fiction, like they're not paying in order to read the book. Like it's not like that's not the exchange that's happening.
mm,
It's much more of a patronage kind of model where they like either the fiction or the writing help that I put out, and they just like it, and they're like, I want more of this, and I want to just make sure there's always going to be more of this. So I'm going to take out a paid subscription, and it's a vote of support for me generally, rather than I want to read your book, and that's what I'm paying for.
Yeah.
And I think once I made that mental shift, it all started to make a bit more sense. And I think with serial fiction in particular, that's a useful way to look at it, because serial fiction is a weird thing. Like, why would someone choose to read really slowly from probably a relatively unknown author over a very long period of time, and with all the inherent risks that we talked about earlier, when they could just go and pick up a really good book from a bookshop and read that? It's a weird decision to make. So I think people that are interested in doing that are interested in the process itself. Like, they're the kind of the reading equivalent of people who buy a movie on DVD and watch all the extras. That's the kind of reader that I'm after. At which point, yeah, it's less about the product and more about the whole experience and being close to the person that's creating the stuff.
I think maybe there's a sort of general shift at the minute in terms of media back towards a gradual, steady drip feed of entertainment now. I think we've been through our real heavy streaming binge kind of phase in the world, and we're starting to move back towards that episodes of shows appearing once a week or that sort of thing. And it's just funny, it's gone full circle. Like even the fact that there's ads now on the free streaming services or that sort of thing, or they should be free. I think maybe people are now almost overwhelmed with streaming, with binging, with just here's an entire show in one fell swoop, which you can watch in a few hours in one night, and then it's done. I think there is a shift more towards we want it in little small doses that we can savor and enjoy. And
Mm.
maybe that's something that serialized fiction is fulfilling for us now as well, where we can go with the author on the journey and see how they're progressing, as you say, and
Mm.
just savor it and enjoy it and then support them without there being a necessary an exchange of goods in terms of books
Yeah.
and stories.
Yeah. And I think getting to know the person is increasingly important as well, because like you say, when there's infinite content, there's a billion TV shows and books and movies coming out like every day.
Mm.
It all becomes a bit meaningless. Whereas if you do latch on to an author or a filmmaker or a game designer or whatever it may be, that perspective and that human person at the center of it, that's the thing that makes you go, oh yeah, I'll do more of this, or I'll read more of this person's comics or what have you,
Yeah.
rather than it just being like more content, which just becomes anonymous and meaningless slop, and you don't know what to read or what to start. It has to be the creator at the center of it, I think, that gives you the interest in the first place,
Yeah.
which then yeah comes back to that sort of patronage model and slower consumption and yeah, all of that.
Yeah. I think creators and writers are almost like the anchors at the center of it all, hold it all together, and everything gravitates around them. In terms of promoting your each of your sections of your story, Simon, how do you actually do that? So whenever you publish it and you send out the email to your subscribers, do you share that onto notes as well? Does it ever go on social media, or do you just not really mind? Is it just purely to your subscribers via newsletter and that's it?
Yeah, so it goes out to subscribers. I do usually put it on notes like I don't know, half a day later or something. I'm still figuring out the best way to do that, because on notes people don't generally want someone to be like, here, go and read my thing. Like, it's not a very useful note, I don't think. So,
Mm.
if it's a bit easier with my non-fiction stuff where the posts are inherently helpful. But with the fiction, I've started trying to put in, here's what you'll get out of this. Here's the kind of fun stuff that will pop up in this story.
Mm.
So yeah, a little bit of that, but not too much. Like sometimes other people will share it. Like
Mm.
some of my readers will share it somewhere, which I always think is much more useful. But yeah, it's tricky. And I don't bother with any other social media these days. Like back in the day, I would post something on Wattpad and then I'd share it on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and whatever else was going on. And it took like a weird amount of time. Like, even though each of those things individually shouldn't take very long, it like was a major faff. And this, but especially these days, like it's all pointless because like no one sees it, no one clicks on it. It's just a waste of time, really. Yeah, but it's interesting because with serial fiction, like every chapter is a book launch in theory. Each week you get an opportunity to find new readers and do something new. It's not just chapter one that does that, and it's all or nothing. I've been doing Triverse for over 3 years now, and
Oh.
which is a long time. But it's interesting how readers have shown up like
Mm.
along that road. It's not just the people who were there at the launch who are reading. It's like new people have arrived. Yeah, there's interesting opportunities, but I think the internet's a weird place at the moment. Like it's hard to get the word out, which is why Substack's doing a really interesting job in terms of getting it to the people that have chosen to read it, but then also building in some interesting ways to find new people.
Mm.
But yeah, it is tough. It's really hard. And I think when I started the newsletter, social media wasn't entirely useless. So that was quite useful at the start, but then increasingly over time, just it's social media serves itself and doesn't do anything else that's of value these days, from my perspective anyway. I think it probably varies depending on what you're writing and what you're doing, but yeah.
Yeah, I think most of it is going that direction, unfortunately. And do you have future plans to take anything you've serialized online and put them into print form? Is that something you could see yourself doing, or do you just want to keep it entirely online?
No, it's definitely something I should do more of. So I've only done that with one story, No Adults Allowed, that I serialized back in 2020. I've converted that into a paperback and an ebook,
Hmm.
which is what I consider the definitive version of it now. And I definitely should do that with all my other stuff, but I haven't got around to it because there's always going to be loads of readers who just won't read a serial,
Hmm.
but for all the reasons we've discussed, like they are a weird way to read. Some people love it and like it's quite an exciting way, but some people will just want a book. So yeah, I should definitely collate all the stuff and edit it into a novel style form and publish it that way. But yeah, it's just a matter of finding the time to do it. I think when I finish Triverse, I'll probably focus on doing that for a while. Because yeah, there's always going to be a whole other cohort of readers who will happily read your story, but not in a serial form. But if you just package it up for them and go, here you go, then they'll jump on board. And then they might come and check out your next serial.
Yeah, I think I'm in the process right now of trying to self-publish my first adult horror novel. And I can see why in many ways more it's so much easier just to publish online because it's just such a there's far fewer barriers. It's just a easier, smoother, more enjoyable process a lot of the time than trying to figure out the nitty-gritty of getting your page count right and all your dimensions and getting your cover done and all that sort of stuff and just the whole process, how long it actually takes to do it. But I'm fascinated by the idea of publishing online. Like as I said, I am publishing one novel there at the minute in serialized form, and that's what I'm going to move into next. So now that I've finished the book that I've just finished writing today, I'm going to revisit the novel that I've been sharing segments of before because it's unfinished. So I've only written like 20,000 words of it, and now I'm going to move back into that and start publishing it on a weekly basis, or maybe yeah, weekly basis on my Substack publications. You can see how I'm doing, Simon. You can monitor it and then give me some pointers on the way if you want to tell me to
Yeah.
stop doing certain things or do more of other things. But yeah, I think this is a fascinating conversation because I think a lot of people don't realize they can do this with fiction. They don't realize that they can
Mm.
serialize their work online and how not easy it is, but how much more enjoyable it can be than slogging away in the background by yourself in silence with nobody else to give you any feedback.
Yeah, definitely. I think like publishing for ages, like decades, was a kind of all or nothing thing. You were either published by a publisher or you were not published.
Yep.
And that was it. That was your existence as a writer, which is really hard because most people would then not be published.
Yep.
Self-publishing with ebooks and print on demand changed that around a bit. But yeah, the new kind of subscription-based newslettery style of it is a whole new way of thinking about it.
Mm.
And I find it really interesting because and it's not a zero sum thing. This is what I always say to people. If you publish a serial or go any other kind of indie route, it doesn't stop you from compiling a book of it later. It doesn't stop you from getting an agent and going the traditional route later on.
Mm.
No traditional publisher is going to be annoyed at the fact that you've built up a reader list of 10,000 people that you can email and say, hey, look, I've just had this book published by fancy publisher. I think they're probably catching up a little bit, but the way publishers and agents have basically required writers to have big Instagram followings and big Twitter followings and all this kind of stuff. That will shift now into you need to have a big list, like a big newsletter mailing list. That's what is going to be expected of writers. So
Mm.
building up this stuff can only really help you, even if you want to go down the traditional route. You can do all the things, I suppose, which in the past, yeah, you wouldn't have had that because, yeah, it was all or nothing. Whereas now you can be publishing one thing in serial form, you can be going through the traditional route somewhere else, you can self-publish something else and just do it on a kind of per project basis, which is great. Like
Mm.
it's resetting the power dynamic into the writer's hands a little bit, and then you can just pick whichever form best suits each particular project.
Do you think there will be a more fluid relationship in future between publishers and writers than there is now? There'll be more of a give and take because, as you said, it has traditionally been like a gatekeeping kind of situation where there are agents and publishers who, unless you go through them, you couldn't publish in the past, and now obviously there are ways around that. Is there a point, do you think, where it's going to come together in a way that benefits everybody more than it currently does? do you think?
Maybe, yeah. I think the gatekeeper thing is really interesting because like when I worked at the Writers' Centre, met a lot of kind of first time writers or people just getting started, and there's often a lot of resentment towards traditional publishing and the gatekeepers and what have you. But those things all exist for really good reasons, even if it can be incredibly frustrating. But it's why generally, like obviously bad books are published. Like
Yeah.
crappy books do end up on shelves. But generally speaking, if you walk into Waterstones and buy a book, it's going to be professionally produced of a high quality and it's probably going to be well written to some degree. Whether you like it or not is a whole other thing. Self-publishing is complicated because I think it's amazing and brilliant, but obviously it does also mean that people can publish complete rubbish. And I think the newsletter thing is interesting because yes, someone could publish a newsletter that was really bad, but no one's going to subscribe to it. Like it has to be a certain quality or be hitting some kind of mark
Mm.
for people to subscribe and for it to grow in that way. So I do wonder whether, whereas just tons of self-published stuff on Amazon, for example, it's hard to wade through a lot of that and figure out what's good and what's not good. Newsletters are slightly different because the ones that are good do seem to start to rise up and get noticed a bit. And at different scales, you can have someone who's at 100 subscribers, but is evidently doing a great job and you can see that they're going places. And you've got people that have 10,000 subscribers or whatever and everything in between. But yeah, I do wonder whether that's going to be interesting in terms of how that interfaces with publishers, because for a publisher or an agent, the idea, like occasionally it happened, like with Andy Weir with The Martian and stuff, like occasionally they would find a self-published book and be like, this is great, let's take this and elevate it to a whole new level. But sifting through the huge amount of self-published stuff must be basically an impossible task.
Yeah.
Whereas I think with newsletters, because it has that community aspect and you can see how people are responding to it in more direct ways, it's going to be interesting 5 years from now or 10 years from now, which writers from the kind of online space have also moved into traditional because the publishers came looking for them and were like, you're doing interesting stuff, come and do stuff with us as well. But yeah, I'd be surprised if people just then left like the newsletter
Yeah.
space or
To
their
be
online
traditional. Yeah.
work. Yeah, I think it will be everyone doing a bit of everything and hopefully the best of all worlds. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think that's pretty cool. I like that the idea that it will be there'll be a lot of different things going on, and writing will endure. Not that writing whenever wouldn't endure, but that it will have a firmer footing maybe in the age of AI slop and stuff on the internet. You know what I mean? But Simon, I just want to finish this chat, which has been great, which is a quick question that I ask everyone, and it's just if you could leave people today with a golden nugget of advice about writing online and how they can produce a source of income from writing online, what would that be?
Probably don't write fiction, which is a little bit facetious, but like fiction's really hard,
Yeah.
basically. And obviously, I don't want to discourage anyone from doing it, but I do think there's a risk that if you go into it wanting to make a living,
Mm.
that you're immediately setting yourself up for disappointment and burnout or just general sense of failure. And this isn't just for writing online. Again, when I used to work with a lot of authors, none of them made a living from their fiction writing. Occasionally, you'd meet like a Peter James who cranks out crime novels year after year and shows up in a chauffeur-driven car to events and stuff like that. You've got that level, and then you've got the J.K. Rowling level, but that's not where most people end up. Most writers, even ones you might consider to be really successful, are probably also teaching or ghostwriting or doing some non-fiction stuff around the side of it, doing magazine articles, whatever.
Mm.
Fiction is really hard, basically, which isn't to say you shouldn't be ambitious and go for it. But I think having that knowledge up front so that you don't, when you're not quitting your job in the first year from writing some fiction, like you need to know that's normal. That's what everyone experiences and then go from there. And I think we're all in a really interesting space now where we are figuring out interesting new ways of what fiction means and how it can be published and how it interacts with readers and what have you. And yeah, 5 years from now, it'll be really interesting to see what that scene looks like. Because I think Substack's still relatively new, but fiction on Substack is especially new. I think it feels like we're still figuring out the parameters of it and what it can be. Yeah. But yeah, it's a tough gig, basically. That's a big part of why I also send out the non-fiction kind of writing tips newsletter, because that's almost like the hook that brings people in, and then the fiction is sort of the proof that I know what I'm talking about.
Mm.
So people might arrive because they're interested in writing fiction online or serial fiction. They read some interesting tips, and then they're like, oh, this guy also writes stuff himself. So he's not just like some self-appointed guru who never actually does it. Like he's actually doing the book, and then they read the book and they're like, oh, I quite enjoy this book. And then, there's a nice little loop going on there. I think if I was just publishing the fiction, it would be by itself, it would be a lot harder to get people in. So figuring out what that means for you. Are you going to be happier with slower growth and smaller numbers if you're just sticking to your fiction, or do you have something else to offer? Is there some unique experience that you have, or something you can share alongside it that lets people in or teaches them something that
Mm.
can enhance the whole experience?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that balance is so key, and that's great advice. And I think I've heard other people say that same sort of thing. Like Evelyn, when she was on here, talked about that a little bit too, about not all in and having other sources of income as well alongside it. And none of it is any kind of failure. It's just you're setting yourself up for the long term and you're being more realistic about it. And I think a lot of writers aren't realistic about it when they dive in and think their book is going to change the world and doesn't, and then they get very disappointed and just stop writing, which is terrible because they should keep going if they can. But I think if you have those expectations that are realistic and are grounded, and you spread yourself nicely around a few different streams of income, I think it works really well. And it's interesting just with your flywheel, Simon, about you're telling people how to do it and then you're proving that you can do it and you know what you're talking about, and it's that like cyclical effect, which is really nice. Yeah, doing a great job with that. But it's been great to chat to you today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Really looking forward to it, and it's definitely delivered in terms of enjoyment.
Thank you. No, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I can talk endlessly about this stuff, as some people have noticed.
So can I. I could talk about it all day. This conversation could easily go on for another hour with no break. But yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Simon. And I'll be following very closely what you're doing in terms of your fiction and you writing about how to write as well. I'm really interested in that too. You've written a piece for my publication, which was great and very well received. And so you do know what you're talking about. I can confirm to anybody listening or watching right now, this guy knows what he's talking about. But yes, great to have you here today, and really hope you enjoy the rest of your week from this point onwards. This is Monday when we're recording this. So Simon, was very good to meet me here now at the start of the week. But yes, I will see you on Substack really soon. Yeah.
That's great. No, thanks, David. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, it's a cool podcast. I need to go and listen to more episodes now.
Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Hey friend, thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed it, or if you enjoyed any previous episodes of the How to Write for a Living podcast, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast episodes. Don't forget you can also subscribe to my mailing list on Substack on How to Write for a Living. It'd be great to see you there as well. But definitely make sure you check out all previous episodes of the podcast. Give them a listen. It'll be well worth your time, and I'm sure you'll enjoy them. Don't forget to subscribe here and on Substack, and I will see you again really soon. Thanks for listening.